Good morning, everybody. I'm Jacob, and you're listening to the Lose Intelligence Podcast. Today I was able to sit down with Indy Neidell. We talked about his life and impressive accomplishments, including the history-centric show The Great War on YouTube and his previous work on Swedish MTV, as well as general questions about the First World War, a subject in which he has extensive knowledge. Unfortunately, due to technical difficulties, by which I mean human error, I've lost the first 8 minutes of this interview. Now that's disappointing, but thankfully the remaining 30 minutes aren't reliant on the part that I lost, so I'm going to go ahead and let it play. I hope you enjoy.
Yet. And he sent us the one that he thought that was the best. It was this girl, and obviously she didn't have all the old footage, but she was using drawings and stuff, and it was really good. It was a really good episode of something I hadn't even got to yet in the war, and I thought that was really flattering. And I like the flattering things is that we get fan art, of course, but there's a guy who designs military uniforms. I had to send him all my measurements because he's sending me a British officer's uniform tailored for me, which weird but cool, you know.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I love that people are using us in history classes, that we're now recognized as an official source of history for the war by historians and teachers, and by like the World War I Centennial Commission in the United States. You know, I've been talking to them a lot because it's almost 100 years since America joined the war, so there's a lot going to be going on there. Yeah, bit of a rambling answer, but
No, it was good. It was a good answer, though.
Thank you.
Yeah, you guys do a really good job, and I could see how it could be used a lot like that. Have you ever been to the World War I museum in Kansas City?
I have, actually. I was there last fall, and I didn't intend to go to Kansas City to go to the museum, but just by random chance, several old friends of mine from the 80s, not people who were really even friends of each other, happened to be living in Lawrence, Kansas. So I was going to Houston to visit my family, and I stopped in Lawrence, Kansas for a few days, and figured as long as I'm there, I better go to the museum. The museum's great. It was very cool. I have a problem when I see a lot of World War I things now, since we've done so much work on it, that I always see a lot of errors and inconsistencies or biases and stuff that, particularly in films and documentaries of it, not so much in scholarly books. Those are pretty good. But the museum was surprisingly error-free, and it actually did a good job of not making it like really America-centric or something, but actually, being a lot more even-handed with a war that, while you can argue which countries are more responsible for starting it, just because it didn't have a real bad guy. It had enemies, but it didn't have a bad guy. I mean, World War II, you couldn't ask for a bad guy than Hitler if you were like creating a bad guy, Yeah. But the First World War, it didn't have a bad guy. The Russians and the Germans weren't any worse or better than each other, It had enemies, and that's what people often misunderstand about it, So, I mean, just because you start a war doesn't mean you're the bad guy. And it wasn't really just the Germans that started the war. It was a combination of five and a half, let's say, countries that started the war. So
Yeah, a lot of moving parts there.
yeah, it's a lot of dominoes to fall.
Yeah. What have you heard people talk about how some people say the war was a meaningless war, and then others kind of try to defend it and say that there was maybe some great danger that dismantling Germany at that point was good? I mean, how do you feel? Do you think the war should have been avoided?
Well, it's funny that people talk about Germany because, the dismantling. Germany, again, wasn't the bad guy in the war. Germany was one of many aggressors in the war. But, I mean, it'd take me 20 minutes to go into the alliances and the actual bits and stuff of why the war started. But a necessary war, I think in many ways it was an inevitable war. I mean, for example, the German High Command had said, Moltke and people and Bethmann Hollweg had been writing that, Russia had been moving along with their railroad development so much that by 1917, if there was a war between Russia and Germany, Germany would not be able to overcome the Russian manpower advantage with technology because the Russian railroads would be sufficient to move the troops around. So better a war in 1914 than 1917. But Germany also had the largest population of socialists in Europe, particularly in the Reichstag, and they were all anti-war. And they would need a very strong excuse to persuade them to go to war, which they eventually got, but I don't need to get into that. So it was everybody, and when I say everybody, I mean everybody wanted the war. Nobody thought it was going to be a 4-year war that killed tens of millions of people. Remember, this was the war that was going to be over by Christmas. Austria-Hungary, Conrad von Hötzendorf, the Austrian army chief of staff, had petitioned Emperor Franz Joseph for war with either Serbia or somebody in the Balkans, but mostly Serbia, 26 times in the 2 years before 1914. 26 times he'd said, we need to go to war. It'll be glorious. It'll be great for the empire. We can take over more of the Balkans, get more influence. He dreamed of an empire that stretched all the way to Afghanistan, actually. Nobody was anti-war except the populations of the countries. The French government was still, the French people were still smarting from losing Alsace-Lorraine to the Prussians, the Germans, in that Franco-Prussian War in 1870. The Germans still held that territory. The French hated the Germans. I think it was a completely unnecessary, vicious, evil, terrible war. But I also think just the way the systems were set up, it was inevitable. There were plenty of people that warned that this would not be a quick conflict over by Christmas, that this would be a drawn-out, disastrous conflict. And sure, there were really good things that came out of the war. Medicine advanced in those 4 years more than it has advanced in a 4-year period either before or since. Medicine had never advanced like that. You have all these inventions and discoveries that became part of everyday life that because of the war. Cellucotton, blood banks, the zipper, radio communication. These are soy sausages. These are all things that came out of the war, but at what a cost,
Yeah.
I don't think it was a necessary war, and I don't think it was a good war in any way. It was all wars are horror stories, but it was a horrible war. It was a particularly cruel, particularly merciless, and mostly inevitable, as the way the European alliance system and the European jingoistic attitudes of the day were set up. So yeah, sorry, that's a long answer there. I hope that was okay.
No, it was great. Speaking of the alliances, why do you think the Entente, I believe, right?
Yeah. You can call them the Allies if you want. A lot of people do.
But isn't it more? Wasn't the other side, the Allies, really more in the?
Well, they were.
Very confusing.
Before the war, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy were the Triple Alliance. So, it's more intuitive to call them the Allies. But of course, Italy did not honor its commitment once the war began, and because we call France and in Britain and Russia, we call them the Allies from the Second World War. Everybody knows what you're talking about when you say the Allies are the Central Power, so it's accepted. You can call them the Entente if you want. But what was the question?
Yeah. Why are there so many more countries on the Allies side than on the Central Power side when you just look at the overall stat sheet of who's on whose side?
Well, when the war began, you had Germany and Austria-Hungary against Serbia's ally Russia, Russia's fast ally France. Russia and France had a very strong alliance. And then Britain joined the Entente side. And Belgium, who was still neutral, but was obviously being invaded, so was still fighting. So you had those initially there. The only reasons people really joined, the first couple of years joined the war, was because of land and glory. By the fall, with Russia looking somewhat on the ropes and things actually looking quite well for Germany and the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Ottoman Imperial Minister of War, Enver Pasha, pretty much single-handedly brought the Ottoman Empire into the war. That was not something that was fully predicted, but he saw a glorious modern Turkey that looked to itself and not to Arab nationalism, looked to itself for its future, and which eventually would come to be under Ataturk, but Enver Pasha would not be around to see it. But he wanted to join the war, and he saw the best means of advancing that by joining Germany and Austria-Hungary. Now, when Italy joined the war, there were the irredentists. There was a lot of land that had primarily Italian populations that was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And long story short, because we did whole episodes about Italy's descent into war and why it didn't honor its commitment to Germany and Austria-Hungary before the war, and instead joined the Entente and attacked and fought Austria-Hungary. It was for land. It was for land and national glory. Bulgaria felt poorly treated after the Balkan Wars in 1912 and 1913 and joined the war for land. Once Germany and Austria-Hungary were going to invade Serbia combined, Bulgaria thought, I'm going to get me some of that action. I want some land. In 1916, when the Russian Colossus had the Austro-Hungarian army on the ropes, Romania saw that and thought, hey, we can take over all of eastern Transylvania with an ethnic Romanian population. It was for land. All of those countries joined for land. Japan joined the war. Japan could... Germany had its protectorate in Qingdao in China. Well, they're not going to do a lot to defend that. That felt pretty quick. It was for land. It wasn't so much ideological like we think more in the Second World War. Now, the United States joined for a variety of reasons. Once Germany started unrestricted submarine warfare again in 1917, they realized that the United States, this might well be the tipping factor, which it was, for the U.S. to join the war on the Allied side. But they thought that they could actually knock Britain out of the war in 6 months, and that would be all. Then the war would end up being over. Once they knocked Britain out, then they could deal with France, and Russia was pulling out because of the revolution, so it left them in a good position. It was a really, really bad decision, but nevertheless. But you got to realize, America at the beginning of the war could have gone either way. German immigrants made up the second largest language-speaking group of immigrants in America. And you had millions upon millions of people that were either immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants. There was an Anglophile community that wanted to support the Allies. But obviously, all of the German immigrants, again, millions and millions of them with thousands and thousands of their own language publications, they supported the Central Powers. The Irish supported the Central Powers because the Irish were against the English, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The American Jews supported Germany and Austria-Hungary because in 1905 there had been huge pogroms and massacres of Jews in Russia. So you had a huge section of the United States that was for the Central Powers when the war broke out. But one very important thing, Britain controlled the seas, and Britain cut Germany's transatlantic cables at the very beginning of the war. So all news from Europe that came to the United States was routed through Britain. So obviously, you could see what you can do with propaganda if you're the only one telling what's going on. You can exaggerate the German atrocities. You can downplay the Russian atrocities. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that was, again, a long answer. But so many more. By the later periods of the war, okay, Brazil joined the Allies late in the war, but too late to make a meaningful difference. But certainly the European ones, it was for personal gain. It wasn't for ideology. It was for land.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of it was seemed opportune at the time to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, you'd think that after watching like 8 other countries jump in and then having millions of their young men die, you'd think maybe this isn't the best guy, but nobody thought that. They thought, we're going to be different.
I know Germany couldn't get it done, but Bulgaria were the difference makers.
Well, here's the thing. Now, when you think of the First World War, Bulgaria is pretty much not the country you think of. But I will tell you this. Of every single country that fought in the First World War, the country that mobilized the greatest percentage of its population was Bulgaria. Not the French, who were fighting on their own soil. Bulgaria sent a greater percentage of its men to war than any other nation in the First World War.
Wow. Yeah, and you really don't think of Bulgaria, but
no,
seems like they did have a bit of a role there.
Oh yeah, they were. I mean, they did quite well actually in the Balkans at times. They had their moments. They certainly weren't, the German army or anything like that, but they had their moments,
Yeah. So there's a lot of negativity coming out of the First World War. What would you say is your favorite positive story coming out of the war?
Well, there are shining moments of humanity, sure. But that's among death and destruction, and it's nice to read about that. My favorite positive thing, the most positive thing, are things like what I said, like the leaps in medical technology. I mean, if you got wounded in a war in 1880 or 1870, you were pretty much going to die. By 1917, 1818, that was not the case. Um, you had some positive movements that grew out of the war, the peace movement and internationalism. Of course, you also had fascism on the other side. But really, the leaps and bounds in technology that brought, okay, um, several historians have said this before. From 1914 to 1918, the world moved from 1870 to 1940. I think that is the most positive thing that came out of the war, because so much of what we take for granted today didn't exist, and we would not recognize the world of 1912. We wouldn't like it. We'd be bored, we'd be unhappy, we'd be poor, we'd be miserable, we'd be underfed, we'd be malnourished, we'd be facing a variety of ways to die. You would be stuck in rigid class systems in most countries or empires. I mean, not one, not two, not three, four empires ceased to exist because of the First World War. Those are empires that had emperors at their throne. The Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the German Empire ceased to exist. That's an enormous shakeup to the world. An entire aristocratic and imperial system died, and most of the nations, obviously the Soviet Union grew from the ashes of that, but most of those nations eventually became republics and democracies. You had women's suffrage in the wake of the war became not only an issue, but women gained the vote in huge chunks of the world, including the United States. That is a very, very positive thing. I mean, if half of your population, half of your adult population does not have a vote, then you don't really have a democracy if you think about it, you know?
Yeah.
So you could say that. Otherwise, you could say the leaps and bounds in technology and medicine, because things that we take for granted today that make our world a better world did not exist before that war.
That's a good thing to take from it, I guess.
Yeah.
So, do you think there's a way that the war could have ended up going the other way with Germany and the Central Powers coming out on top?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, during the German plan at the beginning, once they were supporting Austria-Hungary, who was attacking Serbia, Germany did not want a two-front war. And the plan, the Schlieffen plan, the reason they went through Belgium was to beat Russia as quickly as possible so they could beat France as quickly as possible so they could focus on Russia and not have to deal with a two-front war that they got. I don't see a specific point where the Central Powers were near victory, but there were points where the war itself could have ended earlier. 2 years ago, 100 years ago, like this summer, in the summer of 1916, when Russian General Alexei Brusilov launched what was become known as the Brusilov offensive against Austria-Hungary. It broke the back of the Austro-Hungarian army. They were never the same after that. And it came not only close to knocking Austria-Hungary out of the war, but even the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, if you watch our episodes from the summer, you'll see why that didn't happen. But everyone realized this. Everyone in every country realized that if Austria-Hungary was out of the war and Russia could send all those hundreds of thousands of troops fighting against Germany, there's no way Germany would have been able to hold out by itself against everybody. So it really could have ended the war in the summer. That was the greatest chance before the war actually ended. Now, the Kaiserschlacht, the German spring offensive in 1918, completely broke through the Allied lines in the Western Front. This was taken because since Russia had left the war and Germany had brought all those men over to the Western Front, but it was only a question of time until millions of trained men, really started arriving from the United States, right? Because it takes time once you declare war to get people over. So this was the time to attack. And it completely broke through the Allied lines. And the only thing that prevented that from actually succeeding was supply and logistical problems. They just could not keep the offensive going long enough. But that, and of course, the very beginnings of the war when they were stopped outside of Paris at the Battle of the Marne, those were the two greatest chances that the Central Powers had for winning the war. But the side that came closest to winning the war before the war was actually over was the Entente, and it was directly because of Russia in the summer of 1916 when they very nearly knocked Austria-Hungary out of the war.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, I've read a lot of stuff about this. Well, I could talk about this for ages. It's funny that I realize sometimes I'm like, I really know a lot about this war, you know?
Yeah, well, you do, and that's good. That's good for interviews at least.
Yeah, I think so. It's also good for like, now that we have so many fans, it doesn't matter if I'm in the States or Germany or here in Sweden, I get recognized pretty much every day or so. And it's not like people just want to come up and say, hey, you're that guy from the Great War. People actually come up and they ask me questions about the war, and I'll spend like 20 or 30 minutes just talking with these complete strangers that are about some question about the war, which is great. I love it, you know?
Yeah, I would assume usually they'd run up and say, hey, you're that guy from that 90s Swedish MTV show.
Yeah, they don't do that actually. That stopped happening well over 10 years ago.
All right. So what I can't help but come away with when I learn about the First and Second World War is the effectiveness of the German army. How did it stay so effective between the wars with so much changing in Germany and really the army practically being disbanded in part?
Well, that's a bit beyond the scope of my channel, and I'm not by no means a World War II scholar.
Yeah.
But now I don't know if I should really answer that because I don't want to answer it either weakly or poorly.
I feel like you'd have a very good amateur's guess.
Well, the German army was, people think when they're looking at the First World War, they think, oh, the Germans had the best army in Europe. That's not entirely true. When the war broke out, the British regulars were the only fully professional army in Europe. Now, there were only 100,000 of them or so, because Britain relied on its navies. But the British regulars, when they first ran into the Germans at the Battle of the Marne, they just stopped them cold. There were no better actual fighting men than those regulars. By November, December, most of those guys were dead, dying, or wounded. And that's when Britain began, the Lord Kitchener's drive and recruited its regular forces, which were great forces. But also, the colonial armies, particularly the British colonial armies, the Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand forces, nobody, particularly the Germans, thought they would be a one-for-one match for the German soldier. But I have to point out, especially the Canadians really were. They were as hard as nails. They were as hard as the German soldiers, especially when they had regular equipment. Now, the Germans pioneered their stormtroop tactics, which would serve them very, very well in the Second World War. The Allies were working on, their invention, the tank. German tanks in the First World War weren't much to sneeze at. In fact, they would rather use captured British Mark I or Mark IV tanks than use their own tanks because the British tanks were a lot better. The tactics used by the end of the war in 1918, these are the same tactics that were adopted wholeheartedly by the Wehrmacht in the 1930, particularly the stormtroop doctrine, which in every army and every division there were stormtroop battalions, the pioneers and the Jaegers, that worked well concentratedly in the shock and fear tactics, which, well, the Italian Arditi did actually work with that as well. And it was first pioneered by the Russians, but it was the Germans that really took that to the next level. And of course, that and the tactics they used during the Kaiserschlacht, the overwhelming force, what you would later call the Blitzkrieg, that led to their successes in the early parts of the Second World War. And once you've overrun France, holding a country is often easier than taking it. As to the buildup, well, once Hitler had come to power, nobody was really doing much about it. People were saying, "Oh, no." Once when the Ruhr was rearmed, they reopened the armament factories, and by 1932 something, people were complaining, but nobody was doing anything about it because people thought No way are we going to have another war like that. I mean, Christ, the last one caused tens of millions of deaths. Nobody'd be stupid enough to do that again, right? But I
Yeah.
think French Field Marshal Ferdinand Foch actually put it best after the armistice that ended the First World War. And he was looking at the terms and looking at what was written. And he said, "This is not a peace. This is just a pause for 20 years." He was wrong by 1 year.
Very close, though. You got to commend him
Yeah,
for that.
yeah. He could see the writing on the wall already then. So
Yeah, that's Back to the Future levels of almost getting it exactly right.
well, I mean, Foch he had his flaws, but wasn't a bad leader. He was pretty prescient about seeing what was going to happen.
Yeah, it seems like from the First World War, you could have taken it a good way or a bad way. It seems like the Second World War's allies kind of took it the good way, as in we shouldn't start wars. Germany kind of
Yeah,
took it the
or
bad
start
way.
this war. Now, most of the allies in the Second World War, of course, have started plenty of wars in the time since then and even before then, but not world wars that killed, tens of millions of people. Um, you can't say that, Russia or the United States have not started wars since since World War One. That would be a fallacy.
True.
Um, but well, but then we did a special episode. If you go to our channel and search for Adolf Hitler, it'll come up a special on Hitler role in World War One, where he was a message runner and worked behind the lines. He worked under a lot of danger, and he was well rewarded. And his military service, he repeatedly said, actually, it was the happiest time of his life. He said this in the teens and the 20s. He'd never felt as necessary. He'd never been as happy. He'd never felt as useful. So somebody feeling that comes to power, that's going to say something too. But yeah, I think and the German Jews who fought in the army in the First World War. Now there were anti-Semitic elements in Germany, as there were in any country in Europe at the time, and they commissioned a study in 1916 to try and prove that Jewish Germans uh, joined the army in smaller numbers than real Germans,
Yeah.
whatever that means. And when they did, they actually fought in battalions that weren't in the front lines and stuff. And the study was never published because what it actually proved was that German Jews joined the army in far greater numbers, greater percentage than regular real Germans, and actually took more frontline jobs and frontline postings and more dangerous postings because they felt this was a chance to really show what their country meant to them by showing what they meant to their country. Now, a lot of those war heroes, as the 30s rolled on, they did not leave Germany because they could not believe that their military record would not grant them some sort of absolution from what was going on. That they had served their country for 4 years on the front lines, on the Eastern Front, on the Western Front, facing God knows what kind of dangers to prove their loyalty to their country. And they could not believe that their country would turn on them, you know?
Yeah.
So nobody could believe that another war would grow out of this, except for Ferdinand Foch.
That seems like a positive note to end the show on, I guess.
Okay.
Thank you for coming on, Indy.
Well, thanks for talking to me. This has been a lot of fun. Like I said, I love doing these things. It's a lot of fun to talk about the show.
Yeah.
So,
Do you do many interviews?
and maybe one every week or so, every week or two. They become more and more often now, since again, the show's gotten more popular. So,
Yeah, I would.
but I love them because they're never the same questions, which is nice.
Man, that was great, wasn't it? It was awesome having Indy on. He was incredibly informative and a super nice guy. If you haven't already, I urge you to go check out his channel. I'll provide a link and watch his content. You're likely to learn something new in any video you happen to land on. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And also share. It's been fun. I'll see you next time. Thank you very much. Goodbye.